There are people who walk into your life like a storm, loud, unwelcome, and full of disruption. And then, when everything finally goes still, you realize the storm didn't destroy you. It cleared something away you'd been carrying for far too long. That's what Daniel Reeves was to Margaret Calloway. A storm she never asked for. A man she made up her mind about before she ever truly knew him. And the one person, the very last person on this earth, she ever expected to love. Margaret was 53 years old when she moved back to Clover Ridge, Tennessee. She hadn't planned on it. She hadn't planned on a lot of things, like her marriage of 22 years ending on a Tuesday afternoon with a text message, or her youngest daughter moving to Portland, or finding herself standing in the driveway of her childhood home with 2 suitcases and a heart that felt like it had been wrung out and left to dry in the cold. Her mother, Ruth, had passed away the previous spring, leaving behind the small yellow house on Birchwood Lane where Margaret had grown up. Margaret hadn't sold it. She hadn't been able to. Every time she thought about signing those papers, her chest would tighten and she'd put the folder back in the drawer and make herself a cup of tea she never finished. So when her life in Nashville fell apart, the yellow house was waiting. It was the only thing that was. The neighbors had changed since Margaret was young. The Porters were gone. The Hendersons had moved to Florida. The little blue house directly across the street, the one with the big oak tree that used to have a tire swing, now belonged to a man named Daniel Reeves. Margaret learned this on her second morning in Clover Ridge, when she walked out to get her mail, and found a large SUV parked halfway over the edge of her driveway. She stood there in her bathrobe, coffee in hand, staring at it. Then she walked across the street and knocked. Daniel answered the door in a paint-splattered flannel shirt, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a phone tucked between his shoulder and his ear. He held up one finger, the universal sign, for just a second, and Margaret felt her jaw tighten. She waited. She was not a woman who enjoyed waiting. He finally ended the call and looked at her with an easy, almost amused expression. He was tall, broad-shouldered, maybe 55 or 56, with graying hair at the temples and a face that had clearly spent a lot of time outdoors. There was something relaxed about him that Margaret found immediately irritating. "Good morning," he said. "Your truck," she said, "is in my driveway." He looked past her, squinted, and then had the absolute nerve, to smile. "Oh, yeah, I was unloading some lumber last night, and I guess I'd appreciate it if you moved it," Margaret said. She didn't wait for him to finish his sentence. She turned around, walked back across the street and went inside. That was the beginning. Over the following weeks it became something of a pattern. Not the driveway, he didn't do that again. But Daniel Reeves seemed to have a gift for appearing at exactly the wrong moment. He was there when Margaret was struggling to carry her mother's old rocking chair up the porch steps alone, and didn't want help. He offered anyway, and she said she was fine. And then the chair slipped and scraped a long mark down her shin, and she had to go inside and sit on the bathroom floor until the sting passed, both the physical kind and the other kind. He was there at the Clover Ridge Diner on a Wednesday morning when Margaret was trying to have a quiet breakfast with a book, and ended up seated 2 tables away from him, and a group of people who laughed too loud and too often. She couldn't concentrate on a single page. He was there when her car wouldn't start in the parking lot of the grocery store, and she was already on the phone with a tow truck, and he pulled up and said, "I can jump it," and she said, "No thank you, I've already called." And they stood there in an awkward silence until the tow truck arrived 40 minutes later. "Stubborn," her friend Carla said, when Margaret told her the story over the phone. Carla lived in Nashville and had been Margaret's closest friend since college. "You know that, right? You're being stubborn." "I just don't need his help," Margaret said. "You sat in a parking lot for 40 minutes in November." "I was fine." Carla sighed. "Maggie, not every man is Gary." Margaret didn't answer that. She never knew what to say when people brought up Gary. Her ex-husband had not been a cruel man. He hadn't cheated. At least not that she could ever prove. He'd just quietly stopped choosing her, and by the time she understood what had been happening, years had already slipped away. The worst kind of leaving is the slow kind. When someone fades right in front of you, and you keep trying to convince yourself you're imagining it. After 22 years, she'd learned one thing very well. Don't rely on anyone until you've earned the right to be disappointed. She wasn't ready to unlearn it yet. November turned to December. Clover Ridge put up its Christmas lights and the hardware store started playing carols, and Margaret found herself, against her better judgment, beginning to actually feel at home. She started walking in the evenings. The neighborhood was quiet after dark, just the crunch of her boots on the cold pavement, and the soft glow of windows where other people lived their ordinary lives. She found it comforting in a way she couldn't quite explain. One evening she walked past Daniel's house and noticed the light on in the garage. The door was open, and she could see him bent over a workbench, carefully sanding a piece of curved wood. She slowed without meaning to. It looked like the arm of a rocking chair. She kept walking, but she thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, she was baking her mother's shortbread, the recipe she'd been making every Christmas since she was 9 years old, and she made 1 extra tin without really deciding to. She stood in the kitchen looking at it for a long time. Then she put on her coat, crossed the street, and knocked. Daniel came to the door. He looked genuinely surprised to see her. She held out the tin. "My mother used to make these," she said. "She used to bring them to the neighbors. I'm not doing it out of friendliness, I'm doing it out of habit. So, there you go." He looked at the tin. He looked at her. And then he did something she didn't expect. He didn't smile that easy smile. He just nodded, quietly, like he understood something, and said, "Thank you, Margaret." It was the first time he'd used her name. She went home and stood at the kitchen window for a while, feeling strange and unsettled in a way she couldn't name. It was Edna Marsh who finally filled in what Margaret was missing. Edna was 78 years old, sharp as a tack, and had lived on Birchwood Lane longer than anyone. She'd known Margaret's mother for decades, and she had taken it upon herself to look in on Margaret every now and then with a pot of soup or a piece of gossip, usually both. One afternoon in mid-December, Edna settled into Ruth's old armchair and said almost casually, "You know about Daniel's wife, don't you?" Margaret looked up. "I didn't know he had one." "He doesn't anymore," Edna said. "Breast cancer. 3 years ago. They'd been married 28 years. She paused, folding her hands. "He moved here about a year after she passed. His daughter lives over in Knoxville. He bought that house because it reminded him of a place they'd talked about retiring to, someday. A someday that never came." Margaret set down her tea. "He's a quiet man," Edna continued. "Keeps to himself mostly. But kind. He shoveled my walk all last winter and never once mentioned it. That's a kind man." After Edna left, Margaret sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She thought about the rocking chair in the garage. She thought about the way he'd said "Thank you, Margaret." Not with warmth exactly, but with something careful and real, like he meant it in a way that went beyond politeness. She thought about her own grief, which she'd been so sure was private. Her own quiet walks in the dark. Her own way of carrying things alone because she'd forgotten, or maybe never learned, how to let someone help. She wondered, for the first time, if she had been seeing Daniel Reeves at all, or if she'd just been seeing Gary, and maybe a little bit of herself. She didn't go back across the street that week, or the week after, but she watched, in the way that people watch when they don't want to admit they're watching. She noticed that he put a single strand of lights up on his porch. Not the elaborate kind, just one quiet strand. And she noticed that on the night of December 21st, the longest night of the year, the light in his house stayed on very late. She didn't sleep well either. The next morning she found a small package on her porch. A box of tea, chamomile and honey, with a folded note. The handwriting was neat and unhurried. "My wife used to say everyone in grief needs someone to bring them something warm." She was usually right. Margaret read it 3 times. Then she sat on the porch steps in her coat, in the cold, and cried for the first time since she'd moved back to Clover Ridge. Not the quiet, controlled kind of crying she'd been doing in private for months. The real kind. The kind that shakes you and empties you out and leaves you feeling, strangely, a little bit lighter. She didn't know how long she sat there. Long enough for the cold to settle into her fingers. Long enough for Daniel to open his front door. She wasn't sure why. Maybe he'd seen, maybe it was just coincidence, and stand in his doorway for a moment, not saying anything, not coming over, just present. Just there. She looked up at him across the street. He lifted a hand. Not a wave exactly. More like an acknowledgement. I see you. You don't have to be fine. She nodded once. He went back inside. Christmas came and went quietly. Margaret drove to Portland to see her daughter, Lily, who had recently gotten engaged to a woman named Sophie. They had a small apartment filled with plants and mismatched furniture, and more warmth than Margaret had felt in any room in a long time. She stayed for 5 days. She laughed more than she expected to. She cried a little when she got back in her car to drive to the airport, but in a good way. In the way that means something was real. When she came home to Birchwood Lane on the 27th, there was a small clay pot on her porch with a single green shoot pushing up through the soil. No note this time. She didn't need one. She put it on the kitchen windowsill, in the spot where the light was best. January in Clover Ridge was cold and slow. The neighborhood pulled inward the way small towns do in winter. Margaret started going to a community book club that Edna had been after her to join since October. There were 8 of them, mostly women in their 50s and 60s, a retired schoolteacher named Frank who always brought brownies and had excellent taste in fiction, and occasionally Daniel, who came when his schedule allowed and always had read the book more carefully than anyone else. The first evening she walked in and saw him sitting at the far end of the table, she almost turned around. She didn't. She sat down and told herself it was fine. And slowly, in that way that things happen when you stop trying to control them, it was fine. And then it was better than fine. He was funny in a dry, understated way she hadn't expected. He listened when people talked, really listened, in a way that made you feel like what you were saying mattered. He disagreed with her about the ending of one of the books and they argued about it for 20 minutes. And it was the most engaged she'd felt in a conversation in longer than she could remember. Walking home in the cold afterward, she felt something shift inside her. Not a dramatic shift. Not a thunderclap. Just a quiet settling, like furniture finally finding the right arrangement in a room. She wasn't sure what to call it. She wasn't sure she needed to call it anything yet. It was February when she finally asked him about the rocking chair. They'd fallen into an easy pattern by then, running into each other at the diner, waving from driveways, talking at book club, the occasional brief conversation on the walk she still took most evenings. She had not fully let her guard down, but she'd stopped being afraid of him, which she'd come to realize was really just fear of herself. She asked him about the chair during one of those evening walks, when he'd happened to be walking at the same time, which happened more and more frequently now with no particular acknowledgement from either of them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It was Claire's. Her grandmother's. It fell apart about 2 years before she got sick. She always said she wanted to get it fixed but we never got around to it." He paused. "I found the pieces in the back of the garage about 6 months after she passed. I decided I'd learn how to fix it." Margaret walked beside him through the cold dark street. "And how's it going?" He almost smiled. "I've had to start over twice. But I think I'm getting there." She thought about all the things she'd started over. Her life in this house. Her sense of herself without a marriage. Her slow and fumbling attempt at trust. She thought about how starting over isn't the same as failing. How sometimes you have to take something completely apart to understand how it was ever supposed to hold together. "I think that's beautiful," she said. She meant the chair. She meant all of it. He looked at her. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think so too." They walked the rest of the way without saying much. But it was the kind of silence that isn't empty. The kind that holds something. Spring came to Clover Ridge the way it always does. Not all at once, but in small insistences. A crocus through the frost. A morning that smells different. The first evening warm enough to sit on a porch without your coat. Margaret sat on her mother's porch that evening, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea, watching the oak tree across the street fill back in with green. The front door of the blue house opened, and Daniel stepped out onto his porch. He was carrying something. He set it carefully on the porch, and Margaret squinted across the darkening street, and recognized what it was. The rocking chair. Restored. Every piece back where it belonged. He sat down in it slowly, like he was testing something he'd waited a long time to test. Then he rocked, just once, and was still. Margaret didn't say anything. She didn't call out or wave. She just sat with her tea, and let the moment exist exactly as it was. But she felt something in her chest, old and new at the same time. like a door that had been painted shut for so many years finally opening on quiet hinges. Not with a bang or a flourish, but with the slow, gentle ease of something that was always meant to open. She hadn't been looking for this. She hadn't wanted it. She'd told herself, very firmly, in the driveway on a cold November morning, that she was done with wanting things she couldn't control. But love doesn't ask for permission. And sometimes the people who irritate you, who appear at the wrong moment, who won't stop being quietly, stubbornly present, sometimes those are the ones who were there for you all along. Sometimes the storm is the shelter. She rocked gently in her own chair, in the soft Tennessee spring evening. And for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel like a woman waiting for something. She felt like a woman who had already arrived.